everybody, it's Colby from Highway 9 Designs, and today I'm making some replacement shutters for my house. So these are the existing or the old shutters. As you can see, they're in pretty bad shape. So these are about 5 years old. They're starting to sag and become uneven. The paint's bubbling, and it's just easier to make a new set instead of trying to repair these. So we're going to start with the smaller shutter here, and we're going to make them out of 1x6 cedar board. So cedar naturally is more weather resistant, especially when you stain it or coat it. It holds up pretty well long term in the elements. So these are 1x6 cedar boards. That's the nominal length, which means the actual size of them is the width is 5.5 inches by 3/4 of an inch thick, and these boards are 12 feet long. So we're going to bevel the edge of each one of these to match the design of the original shutter. So you can see how both sides beveled right here. And we'll do that with a 45-degree chamfer bit for a router. So I'm getting everything set up right now. For the edge I'm going to bevel, you want to choose the edge that has the least amount of knots. So, not like this. Sometimes when you're routing an edge and you hit one of those knots, it'll break the wood off and not come out. The finish won't be like you want it to be. So I've oriented each of these boards. The face of the board that I'm going to bevel is facing me. I typically just put little arrows on that face or that side of the board like this, just so I don't forget which side has the least knots. So I'm going to go ahead and get these cut to length, and then we'll start to bevel them. All right, so a couple tips on when you're marking measurements. So I typically use a mechanical pencil like this. You can see that has a very fine piece of lead. I think it's like a 0.07 or 0.7 thickness lead. So the reason I do that is because if it gives you a nice thin mark on the board. If you use a pen or a pencil with a wider tip, sometimes the width of that mark could be a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch thick. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you combine that with the width of the saw blade, it can throw your measurement off as much of an 1/8, maybe a little bit more. So it's easier just to use something that makes a very thin line. And then I use this Kreg Multimark tool. So I love this tool. I use it for a lot of different things. And I'll draw a line all the way across the board so that you'll see in a second how I line up the saw blade to make the cut. So that's just a tip. Use a thinner pen or pencil to make marks, and that'll help you keep your measurements nice and accurate. So before you make any cuts, always check a couple of times before you start. So you can see I've got the piece of wood on my miter saw here, and I've got it aligned so that the tooth of the blade is right on the left-hand side of that mark. So now you see what I was talking about when making the mark. That puts me exactly at my measurement and gives me a nice clean cut. All right, so now that I have one piece cut, I can use it as a guide for the remaining pieces. So to do that, just lay it all, the piece you cut on top of the board. Make sure these two ends are flush, so it'll be nice and smooth. There's, the top one's not sticking out or back from the bottom board. And then just come down here. Make sure you hold the piece of wood tight and make a mark. And that helps you keep all of your boards at a nice, consistent measurement. So if you do need to do any trimming after you make the cuts, the easiest way to do that, the way I typically do it, I'll align the edge of the board with just barely touching the saw blade. So that way you can trim off a little bit at a time, just to get everything at the exact measurement. So you may need to do 1 or 2 passes, just moving it over slightly each time so the blade's barely touching. Make a pass or make the cut, and check the length against your other pieces. All right, so these 4 smaller pieces that I just cut are the horizontal braces that go on the shutters. So since these boards are 5.5 inches wide, we're going to need to go ahead and cut those down. So I'm going to mark all those measurements and get them ready to cut on the table saw. All right, so all of these 4 pieces are marked and measured and ready to cut. One thing I wanted to point out, so this is the actual piece, the width that we're going to keep for the brace. Notice here though, I've marked these so that we're going to cut these knots out. So this is the part that we're not going to use, same here. That gives us a chance to get rid of those knots as well. All right, so I'm getting the table saw set up to make these cuts. So setting the blade up is pretty similar to how we set it up on the miter saw. So you can see my line, you can see where the blade is. So the inside edge of the blade is positioned on the right hand side of the mark. So that'll give us a nice clean cut at the width that we want. So I always use caution with the table saw. It's a handy tool, but it can also be one of the most dangerous tools in your shop. So always wear eye protection. Use the guard that is above the blade there, and if you need to, especially with smaller pieces like this, use a pusher stick so your hands don't come anywhere near that blade. All right, so we're going to do the same thing for the larger pieces. These are the vertical pieces for the shutters. So here's another little shop trick. So we're going to cut these. You can see that the tape measure, no real good place to put this end of it to mark the measurement. So what I did was just cut a piece of wood to the length or to the width that these need to be, and then I'll use that to make the mark. So I'll just line it up with the edge and then make my mark. All right, just like we did with the horizontal support, I've marked the measurements on the board so that it'll cut this knot out right here. So it's not gonna probably get the entire thing, maybe about half of it. But as you're going through and marking the measurements on each board, just be mindful of the portion that you'll keep and the portion that you'll cut off. And it's a handy way to get rid of some of those knots. All right, so I've got the table saw set up, ready to cut the vertical pieces. So since these are longer, I took my other cabinet here and put it up against the cart that the table saw is on, so that way I'm just going to push the pieces across and then it'll catch them on the other side so they don't fall after the cut's completed. All right, so now that all the pieces are cut to the correct sides, it's time to bevel the edge. So I'm using this is a Bosch Colt 61005 handheld router. So this is smaller than a full-size router, makes it easier to handle. So we've got a 45-degree chamfer bit in the router, and what you want to do to get set up is once you put the bit in, you'll need to adjust the depth that the router bit's positioned at, and you do that by opening this buckle right here, and then you can slide this piece, the deck of it, up and down. So you've got you can just open it up, twist it to starting depth, and there's also a fine-tune adjustment here on the back as well. So ideally, when you have the router bit it's sitting right at the top of the piece there. So probably a little hard to see. Try that, not in direct sunlight. So I've got it positioned right there where it's right at the top. So always make a couple passes with a scrap piece of wood before you start cutting. It's actually been a while since I've used the router, so I'm going to just do a couple practice runs and then do any other adjustments I need to do to the depth of the bit. Okay, so when you're ready to bevel the larger pieces, you notice from the drawing here that there's a bevel on here, 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 and here. Basically on the inside of the left board, both sides of the center board, and the left side of the right board. So I've marked those out, so you've got arrows pointing to each line where the bevel will be, and these are the outside edges right here. All right, so we're all set up and ready to cut the larger piece. I've got it clamped on this end, so this is nice. It's a bit wider, so I can actually won't hit the clamp with the router. And then over here, I've got a little bit different style clamp. It was better to reach into that position. So clamp it on both sides so it doesn't move around while you're cutting the bevel. So one other thing, so routing these edges creates a lot of dust, and it's very fine dust, sawdust. So it's best so you don't breathe the stuff in to either wear a respirator like this or just kind of mask. That way you're not breathing in those very small particles as you route the edge. So here are a couple tips for beveling the edge of the router. So when you start the cut, come in a little bit. Don't try and start it right here at the edge. So as you can see, when I was making the cut, I would start right about here, push it all the way to the end, and then come back and finish this edge going the opposite way. So I messed up one of these, and this is what happens if you start too far out to the edge. So the router bit will grab this short side of the board here and not, make a clean cut along the face. So that's that's an idea between starting a little bit in from the edge. When you're actually pushing the bit across the board, let the bit do the work. Don't try and force it or push it faster than it wants to go. So it's it's removing all that material as you push it, and it'll walk along at its own speed. Just guide it. And try and keep everything in a straight line. You can kind of use the marks on the wood somewhat. Just watch the this edge of the router as you're pushing it along. So here's a good example of why these knots in the wood can be difficult. You can see right here, as soon as the router bit hit that knot, it flew out. So not ideal, of course, but I should be able to fix this with some wood filler, and you probably won't even really be able to tell there's a hole there. So that's why you want to keep the knots out of the sides. All right, so you got one set complete. So you can see all the bevels are cut. The bevels are cut on the horizontal pieces. There's on the bevels, there's a couple of places here where the edge is kind of wavy, but that's all right. For the most part, we can just sand those out to even out the bevel across the board. So you want to do the sanding before you attach the boards together, though, because if you don't, it's really difficult to get down in that groove where the bevel is. All right, now so it's about time to start sanding. Our bevels are cut. Before I start sanding, though, I'm going to use this X-Acto knife, small thin blade, and then just go cut all these little pieces off that are still attached from the bevels. So you can do that first on each piece, then we'll start sanding it. right, everything's all sanded down for the first set of shutters. So you can see we've sanded all the bevels down. I've rounded the edges on these as well. So we're going to glue these together now. Just using regular old wood glue. There's a little bit of an edge right there. So I'm going to run glue down the length of the board, push them together, and then we'll use these large clamps to clamp them tight and let them dry overnight. So the shutters are all sanded down and ready to paint. So the first thing that you want to do is put one coat. This is Sherwin-Williams multi-purpose latex primer, and it's suitable for outdoor use or exterior use. Thick coat on the shutters on the back. As you can see, the board on the back side is a bit rougher, so you may have to go through and make several passes at some of these areas to fully coat it. But put one coat on and let that dry. Dries pretty quickly, maybe an hour or so. And then for the actual paint, I'm using Sherwin-Williams Woodscape. So this is an exterior paint. It's flat. And then the color that we're using is, we had it color matched to the color of the old shutters. So when you do the paint, put two nice thick coats of the paint on and then let it dry either for a couple hours or overnight. right, so these are the original hinges that came with the shutters. They're mounted to each side, all four corners, 2 per shutter. And on the house, there's a pin that's mounted near the window that slides into this hole right here. So it's works pretty much like a door hinge. So there's nothing wrong with these. They just need to be cleaned up and repainted. So I used a Dremel carbon steel brush at around like 7,000 RPMs in the Dremel tool. And then just ran the carbon brush over the surface of it, and it cleans it up pretty nice. So you can see there's some marks here from the brush. That's fine. They'll be covered up by the primer and paint. Just go all the way around, do all the edges, and then you will be ready to paint these. All right, so to paint the shutters, we're going to use this Rust-Oleum clean metal primer. So I'll spray 2 coats of that first. Then the paint is, again, Rust-Oleum flat protective enamel. I'll probably do 3 coats of this. And to top it off, this is Rust-Oleum clear top coat, dead flat. So do 3 coats of that as well.